Eric Hutchins. He is the Gulf of Maine Habitat Restoration Coordinator in Gloucester. He has provided technical and financial assistance to over 300 habitat restoration projects throughout the Gulf of Maine, including dozens of dam removals, fish lands, and wetland restoration projects.
All right, out of curiosity, just a kind of a sound check from everybody. This is kind of my talking voice. Those of you know, I usually talk a little bit loud, but I want to make sure everybody can hear what I'm saying, because the slides are going to be tough to see, so that sound is a little bit lower. I have no control over the sun. We needed a cloudy night, but everybody okay? You're okay in the back? Okay, that's a good sign. But I will stretch out our introduction a little bit, and that way we'll go through this. I want you to see as many of the slides as you can. Again, my name is Eric Hutchins. I live here in Rockport, and I know many of you in this room. I'm not wearing my fisheries service hat this evening, and I'm not wearing any committee hat. I'm here just speaking as opinions and experiences of my own in those positions over the years. And at this point, I've got about 28 years since I moved back with my wife moved back to Julie McMahon, who many of you know, moved here 28 years ago, and got engaged with protecting waterways, our aquatic resources, drinking water, basically anything environmental that we put our hands on. And over on that table over there, as Carrie mentioned, what I brought, I have a box of stuff that I keep in my cellar, which I bring to presentations now and then. I've got about 10 times that amount between my office and scattered around my yard and everything else. But it's working in waterways, which have basically been the dumps for many towns throughout New England since the 1600s. When you go moving culverts, or moving bridges, or moving dams, you find interesting junk behind them. And I find stuff all the time. And a lot of it's really preserved really nicely. So as you brought a smattering of stuff in there, please take a look at it. I'll be over there when the talk is over. And there's a few things they might have a few questions on. Some fun things. And the gun is not real. There's a gun over there. So for clarification, I thought it was real when I found it. So I'm poking around in the mud behind a dam removal site. And I come across a gun. And I'm like, oh boy, I gotta report this. It's heavy. Everything about it feels real. Ends up, it's a pellet gun, so it's technically a little bit of a gun, but it's not a licensed gun. It's kind of a toy, but kind of an advanced toy, but it's not real. Just want you to know that. So, first couple of slides are going to be tough, and all we can do is hope for that sun to set. And I'm not going to mind at all, since buying time now will be fine. As we go through, if you have questions. This is not a formal scientific presentation where I only want to hear questions at the end. If what I'm saying incites a question, we can take a few as we go, and that'll buy time for that sunset. But otherwise, I'll keep up with the dialogue and do the best I can. And Diane's going to be doing the slides for me, and basically, my guess is you can't read that, but I'm going to read these the best I can for you. 28 years of watching the water. Basically a personal history and reflection of protecting and restoring Rockport aquatic resources. I am going to focus on Rockport, though I'm going to touch on other activities that I've done throughout the Gulf of Maine over close to the past 30 years. That is the region that I do my professional work. Okay, next slide. Okay, that one's pretty good. Hopefully many of you can read that with a white background. I'd like to start with just an outline of what I'm going to talk about this evening. Introduction, which I've kind of given. Water-related roles and projects in Rockport. Just going to touch on a little bit of what I've done. And an overview of Rockport drinking water system. The title of the talk this evening probably made a few of you think that I was going to come here and tell you about the mechanics of your drinking water. That is not what I'm doing this evening. I'm going to talk about 28 years of stewardship protecting your water from a community-based level as a citizen of Rockport, as a volunteer, which many of you, how many of you are in the garden club? Yeah, I mean, volunteers. Everyone in this room knows about, and how many of you volunteer for something? I better see every hand go up. Be faithful. You all know what volunteering is about. A lot of this is volunteer time that I've been doing for years with many of you. And then I looked back at 20 years, like, how am I going to package this? And that's what I decided I wanted to do, to reflect a time series of, these things never end. For any of you that are involved in programs or projects, Sometimes they never end. There's no end point. And then working on projects in Pigeon Cove, South End, Long Beach, waterways, Seaview Street, all these projects all over the places, and really focusing on the one that I have the most experience, the most pictures, and maybe the best tales to tell, focusing on Millbrook, which many of you worked in Millbrook as well. So I kind of honed in on Millbrook, and even there I had to eliminate a bunch of stories, because I'd be talking too long. So I'm going to touch on the Tadco groundwater contamination, that was kind of the inception of my interest in these issues, and we'll get to that in a second. Loop pond restoration, doing some grassland restorations, trees, plantings to help water supply. Going to touch on sampling of Millbrook, something that actually my wife Julie led up years ago working with the DPW, and I was a gopher for that project, and we'll touch on that. You'll see some fun pictures there. Wellfield protection plan, working with some consultants and the DPW to come up with a plan to better protect our drinking water. The Mill Pond dam failure. And again, I like to think of things in a watershed perspective. I'm always telling people to lower Millbrook, you need to think about what goes on upstream, and what goes on upstream matters what goes on downstream. It's all of the activities that take place combined that result in water quality, whether that's for the beach, for the Millbrook, for the Mill Pond, for Loop Pond, or the water you drink. All of the activities that take place in that roughly 1 square mile all add up, good, bad, or ugly. And I'm going to show you a little bit of all of them this evening. The mystery bottle case. Does anyone actually know what that is? Does that even ring a bell to anybody? Oh yeah, that one's kind of gross, but we'll get to that one. The railroad upgrades, there are old ones and there are new ones. The railroad will continue to give many of us stories. The next generation loves new stories, but they continue. And then I'll do a little summary and question and answer. Before I dig in, any clarifying questions from anybody?
Where's the pond?
Is what?
Where is the pond?
Oh, yeah, I have a map with me. I'll get there. But Loop Pond, that's fine. Basically, Millbrook, I'll say it verbally, and then I'll know how good the maps will show up. Millbrook, which I'm focusing on, starts at Front Beach, goes upstream through the meadow, over the dam at Millbrook, goes behind a whole bunch of houses and under the streets and under roads and behind shopping malls, disappears in the woods, and about a half-mile upstream is Loop Pond. And Loop Pond, actually the reason it's called Loop Pond, it was built with dams. And Loop Pond was for the old steam engines. The reason it's called Loop is back in the 1800s, trains didn't go forwards and backwards the way they do today. The engine had to be in the front, the caboose always had to be in the back. The loop was built in this big circle so that when the train came from Boston into Rockport, they could back it up slowly, and you'd back the caboose, so to speak, so it was actually, so the train would be heading back to Boston with the engineer in the front. They don't need to do that anymore with the way the trains work. The building, the loop and the dam that created Loop Pond was also for water for the steam engines. So they actually needed continuous water supply around steam engines. So it had twofold purposes. One was for water for the steam engines, and then the other was for the trains to turn around. But just downstream of Loop Pond, which I'll show you in a moment, is the town's well field, one of them. We have 2 well fields in town. One goes back to the 1930s. It's not actually been used in the past couple of years, but I'll get to that. Okay, next slide, please. Just from a little bit of a regional perspective, some of my work, this is what I do most of my daytime work for the past 15, almost 20 years. My job is removing dams. And this is just an example. A dam up in the Souhegan River, a major tributary to the Merrimack River in Merrimack, New Hampshire. That was an old dam that was actually owned by Pennachuck Waterworks, a private water supply company that no longer needed the dam. And we wanted the dam to go down because fish couldn't make it over it. That is my objective with most of my work. The prime directive of my day job is to get fish upstream so they can spawn river herring, salmon, eels, shad. If they can't get upstream and lay eggs, you don't get more fish. They got to reach their spawning habitat. Just as a byline, quick question to anyone in here. Number of dams you think that are in Massachusetts? I mean, we have a couple in Rockport, but quick number, anybody? Anyone want to throw a number out? How many dams are in Massachusetts?
3,000.
Someone's got it, about 3,000. Yes, about 3,000 dams in Massachusetts. That's not culverts, that's just dams. And about 2% of them have any function anymore. They're not flood control, they're not water supply, they're not hydro. They're leftovers from the Industrial Revolution. And almost every single town, other than when you get out to Cape Cod, is loaded with them. And my job has been to facilitate the momentum to remove these dams, to restore our fisheries so they can get upstream. So anyway, there's a before and after of the dam removal project, and some of those bottles over there might be the ones I found behind that dam. Next slide. So that was it from the regional perspective. You can't see this well, but you can at least see the writing. This is Seaview Street. This is the parking lot for Long Beach and Cave Edge Beach in Rockport. And if you look at this picture right here on the pointer, that's the cobble dune behind it. So that's driving down. This was a habitat restoration project. The culvert on the left-hand side that you can't see well was only 18 inches. It was undersized. Salt was probably there for the past 50 years. Someone just throws a culvert in. And that was done everywhere. If you think we have a lot of dams, move the decimal point 2 places over. That's how many culverts we have in the state. We're literally 100,000 plus. And the lion's share of them are not built correctly large enough for fish passage or to allow, in the case of the saltwater one, for the saltwater to get up there. So working with the Department of Public Works, the Conservation Commission, we replaced it. That's the Department of Public Works. We ripped out the old culvert, got a small grant, and installed a 3 by 5 foot box culvert to let salt water get upstream. And this is the site that the school kids have been studying now for over almost 15 years, ever since that new culvert went in. So it allows more salt water to get up there, salt water on the marsh surface, to allow fish to get up on the surface, and allow the marsh to grow, to hopefully keep up the sea level rise as well. So, not Millbrook watershed, but just some of the other projects that I've worked on in Rockport, working on aquatic restoration. Next slide. Water-related roles. I figured it was probably good to throw this in here, and actually a lot of them are dated now. We moved back to Rockport in 1996. I was born in Pigeon Cove. My grandfather was a cover, as well as my grandmother. So this is where my family was from, and had the opportunity to move back. And we moved back in 1996. And we moved on to off Tars Lane, Applecott Road, actually near the well field, on the eastern side of the railroad tracks. Bought a house down there. I very quickly got on the Rockport Conservation Commission. I don't remember the exact dates, but I had 1997, 98. Then I chose to get on the Rockport Planning Board because I felt like I wanted to make some rules and regs rather than just follow them. So I went on the Rockport Planning Board, and I was on there for a number of years working on watershed issues, implementing bylaws for stormwater, working with the DPW on extensions of water lines, sewer lines, all of the water-related issues that our Department of Public Works deals with. Long Beach, and all the things that aren't so fun that we're dealing with today and continue to. A number of years ago, we had something called the Rockport Water and Wastewater Committee. I served on that for a number of years. Myself with my friend Toby chipped away for a number of years on that committee, looking at what was our capacity. And we're still, Rockport is tight with capacity. We don't have a lot of water, and we don't have a lot of sewer capacity, and we haven't added an awful lot even since that time. And so those issues don't go away, and they don't go away quickly, though we've had some successes, though we've had some failures, which you'll see. Technical Advisor to the Millbrook Committee and Conservancy. I never became a member, but I'm always there to help, and especially doing everything I can. Laura Hallwell's in here somewhere. Laura Hallwell has done unbelievable work at Millbrook, and if we could hire you, Laura, we would at my office because her work is that good. And anytime she calls, I do what I can to help. And she often doesn't need my help. Take my word for it, I mean that. And then there's a little bit of a gap in there because we moved. And I moved out into the middle of Dogtown on a to a log cabin out in the middle of the woods. Some of you have probably seen it out there in the woods. And I've been busy for 8 years, fixing up a log cabin, fixing up an old shack, a horse barn, and I'm finally back on a committee as of about a month ago. I'm now officially appointed on the ad hoc water committee. So I'm back on officially on water issues, though I do not represent them tonight. I'll be touching on a number of issues that are near and dear to their heart. And then my day job, which I touched on, Gulf of Maine Habitat Restoration Coordinator. Next slide. This is, I just happened to find this slide. I went through a lot of my old slides just to see, to again, show you a little bit of this history. I don't know why I saved it. This was a poster from 2003. What is the future of Rockport's water resources? This is from the comprehensive plan for Rockport's water and sewer. Looking at water, it could be a $20 million question. That's a real number. If anything, it's probably $30 million today, and we still don't have all the answers. We really don't. We may never. We chip along as a town, as a community, like everybody. But you know, we've got some serious constraints. Anyway, just wanted to put, I found that out there from this 20 years ago, and the issues are just as germane today as they were 20 years ago, and they potentially will be significantly more 20 years from now with climate change, because we do not know where things are going enough to say where our water supply and groundwater is going. Next slide, please. Select recommendations from that plan back in 2003. It was kind of funny. I took a peek at this for tonight's talk. Permitting additional sources of Rockport and water, sources of water in Rockport will be expensive and difficult. No surprise there. That was one of the primary findings of that. This is not an easy town to find water. You don't, not easy to make water. Efforts to build Flatledge Quarry Dam could be indefinitely postponed. How many remember the Flatledge Quarry proposal in here? Oh, interesting. Granite Pier, Granite Harbor. When you go into that Keystone Bridge, there was a proposal for about 15 years that made it to the permitting phase to build a 45-foot high dam to flood out Flatledge Quarry. It got that close to being built. We would have lost that historic resource. We may have gained storage, but I gotta give kudos to one person in particular, and it's actually Ted Tarr. Ted Tarr went to town meeting with a citizen's petition article signed by 10 people to look for deep rock well water in a past town meeting in Rockport. This is where it shows the power of citizens. I think everybody, the boards and committees voted against it. Ted got $50,000, and they found high quality water about 600, I don't remember how many feet deep, about 600 feet deep behind Cape Pond. And it's delivering something like a couple 100,000 gallons a day. I don't remember the exact numbers. Very successful. That likely would have never happened if Ted didn't do a citizen's petition article. It wasn't led by a town committee. It just shows the power of an individual. One of these days we need to name that. And reinitiate opportunity to look at deep rock wells. They were talking about it back then. Okay, next slide. You can't see the detail on here, unfortunately. This is called the Source Water Assessment Program Map. And what this is a map with a bunch of lines, a bunch of squiggly lines showing the watersheds. The state of Massachusetts DEP made this for the town of Rockport. It shows our Zone 1, which is the real important areas next to the wells. It shows the Zone A's, which are next to these buffers, next to our Cape Pond and our Carlson Quarry. So it's all the protective zones. And Rockport's got a pile of them because we actually, we have 5 permitted sources in Rockport. Flatledge Quarry, which is right behind Granite Pier. Carlson Quarry, which is one dam up, which is kind of hidden in the woods. The Loop Pond Wells, which I'm going to show you some pictures and talk a lot more about. Cape Pond, for those on the way to Gloucester, out in the woods behind Nugent Stretch. And then the new Deep Rock Wells. We actually get our water supply from 5 different sources, depending on what's going on that day, that month, or that time of year. They withdraw from one or the other, or pump from this one to the other. I'm not actually to get into the details this evening, but you get the drift. 5 sources, depending on what's going on, one or the other. Sometimes some of the wells can go dry and you turn them off. You don't have a choice. We may be heading in that direction this year. We'll see. Next slide. This is the town's zoning map. And again, a bunch of squiggly lines, but I just wanted to emphasize that we have these permitted supplies in Rockport, which I just showed you, but then we have a bunch of areas that are protected for future water supply and the potential. Back in the 1970s, the town identified a bunch of our watersheds in the South Woods and the North Woods and all these other places. North Brook, Swan Brook, Sawmill Brook, East Brook, and South Brook. These tiny little brooks. Who knows how we may be able to extract from them for water supply in the future. But it's good to protect these areas now, not knowing what the future will bring. Probably above and beyond anything, water is something you have to do everything you can to protect in perpetuity, period. A lot of things we don't have to do in perpetuity. Water we do. Chris?
Who decides which area the water comes from?
That actually would be Chris Martin in particular. Chris Martin, who runs the water department for the Rockport Department of Public Works. So he manages it year after year after year, so you get the feel of, and they'll be actually sometimes seeing the water quality get down in one and they'll switch to another to get higher quality. Well, the water level will go down in Carlson quarries, so they've got to take more from the deep rock wells. But the bottom line is we're only permitted, okay, it was on the early slide, I think 262 million gallons per year. So it doesn't mean you can take more. You have 5 sources, but that's our cap from the state permits. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is, you know, I don't have any pictures here. I probably have some hard pictures somewhere. This is before digital cameras were floating around. It's kind of funny that I was looking for pictures. I'm like, I have no digital pictures back then because we weren't using digital cameras back in the 1990s. Soon after we moved here, out doing dog walks over by Evans Field, multiple days in a row, I was kind of scratching my head, getting new to town, and just seeing, we kept seeing this 40-foot trailer truck. Maybe it was 30 foot. It was a big tanker truck with a hum going on. It was there again the next day, and the next day. And I started asking questions. This is on the other side of the town's well field, about 200 feet away from the actual wellheads. Next to Evans Field is an old factory called the Tadco. The new owners don't own that. This was from the old owners. It used to be the Anadama Bread Factory. And then it became the Tadco Adhesives Company, chemicals, adhesives. I don't know how they exactly discovered it, but the contaminants had been released by the Tadco Company. And what was going on was part of the remediation, pumping the groundwater out, tanker truck after tanker truck after tanker truck, and bringing it to out of town to a facility to treat it. And but I didn't find this. I started asking. I talked to Board of Health. I talked to DPW. I talked to Concom. No one knew anything about it. And I started looking at the reports because it was hidden. It was way back when no one goes, and I often go places where nobody goes. And I started bringing it up with them like, oh, well, DEP's handling that. You know, the state. Well, there's no signs. There's no nothing. But the good thing is it was being treated and it was being addressed. But this is how long something like that took. The notification to DEP of contamination was 98, and compliance wasn't until 90 to 98. 8 years between the discovery and when it got its sign-off. That it was the best they could do. I mean, at some point, you don't ever get 100% of contaminated stuff. There's probably some still stuff down there. But this was in close proximity to our drinking wells. The one thing I did do is I looked through the reports, and they identified our drinking wells as emergency water sources. They misrepresented them. We were drinking that water at that time. That was primary drinking water. I'm not saying we drank any of it, but that was just a discovery of opening the book and looking. These are being run right now. These aren't an emergency. We're using these right now. It's like, and that was my incitement to get more involved locally. To say, this can't be happening. We can't have a toxic waste site cleanup next to a town's well field and no one who's watching the shop. Next slide. So that's the story behind us. And then this is the old Loop Pond gravel pit. There used to be a gravel pit at the end of Tars Lane, near Loop Pond. There was a big depression. Basically, someone sold all the gravel and then sold it to the town of Rockport, I think, for $1. And then the town owned it and was able to take gravel out of it. And I learned they were actually making it larger. The town was at one point. And I started asking questions. And they're like, who are you to ask questions? And I said, well, I'm asking questions. Why are you? And then I found out there was a gentleman's agreement, nothing in writing, that they wouldn't go outside of certain boundaries. And they did. They took a wall down and they needed gravel, so they're digging more gravel out. And I wrote a long letter to the DPW, it was like 14 pages long, and cited the 9 laws they were breaking. There was an emergency meeting that afternoon with all the commissioners and DPW, and they stopped immediately. And the reason being is they were digging a gravel pit in the direction of our well fields with heavy machinery, digging down. You're not supposed to do that next to a well field. You're not supposed to dig deep holes next to a well field. But immediately, it wasn't just to make a problem. We said, let's turn this into a restoration project. We will work with you. Within days, okay, this stops, let's find a way to make this right. And a number of us wrote grants and got funding for the town of Rockport at the small scale, large scale to actually restore this multiple acre site to make it habitat-wise good for water supply, good for rain landing on it. But from the inception, I mean, those are the things we found there. Metal pipes were being dumped there. We found lead fittings, big chunks of lead. Like, this shouldn't be dumped next to a well field. We put a stop to asphalt grindings. There was one when they grind the roads where it goes. Well, I found where some of it was going right next to our well field. So we put an end to that. Next slide, please. And that's kind of what it looked like for a while. They just kind of filled in boomscape. It was so bone dry, there was not a seed, nothing grew there. It was basically just a pile of gravel. And that was the first phase, just kind of covered over, got the bad stuff out. Next slide. Did a pilot project. So let's see if we can grow grassland here. And on this left side, that little area those rocks are, you can't see real well, was an experiment. We used some compost and native grass seeds, which actually wasn't correct. We shouldn't have done that. We were using warm season grasses. We should have planted them on the raw gravel. It was one of our learning lessons. But it grew well, and one of the reasons that's it on the right-hand side last week. That site was pure gravel when we started, and there's a vernal pool there certified right next to that, 50 feet away. So what we wanted to do was buffer that to keep people out of that with trucks and heavy equipment. That's why we put some of the rocks there. This is July 6th, just last week. Completely vegetated. It's mostly black locust, which is semi-invasive in this area. It's a North American tree, and it's beating climate. We brought it north, and it's ready for us because things are getting warmer. It's actually very high habitat value. Next slide. This is back in 1999. If you rummage through the bushes, you will find this plaque that we put on a tree, and I'll just read that. Luke Pond Vernal Pool, restored by the citizens of Rockport for the purpose of promoting biologically diverse and healthy environment, dedicated Earth Day 1999. So the project was kind of an Earth Day project with a bunch of volunteers with breaks, and we had just enough grant money to buy a plaque to put on there. And I'm happy to say that plaque is still there. Someone hasn't wrecked it or stolen it. But it's hidden in there. You can find it. Next slide, please. And then that was the pilot project for just a couple thousand square feet. We said, let's do the whole thing. This was the gravel pit. Multiple acres, all disturbed, dug down deep, dumping pipes and metal and asphalt. And we got money from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, working with Joe, well, it wasn't Joe Parisi, it was John Tomas. We may have been before him when we first started. But working with John, we got a grant from the NRCS, not a lot, $4,000 from them, $4,000 from the CPC, and $12,000 of in-kind services. And that is really cheap to be able to restore 2 to 3 acres of habitat. $12,000, $20,000. And we have the whole thing, for all practical purposes, restored now to a native grassland. It's big blue stem. It's basically prairie grasses that live in native vegetation, which is really good for wildlife habitat, really good for water filtration. So when rain hits it, it kind of slows it down, and that way there can actually hit the well field. It's a little bit more purified and clean, rather than just running through asphalt or whatever else was left there. And this little center circle, that's the vernal pool. So the nice thing about this project, the whole area restored, created a huge buffer around a certified vernal pool that's loaded with salamanders and frogs. What question? Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. Upper left corner, that's the railroad line. It's that little white dot, railroad line. And this now here, at this time, this was a big construction site. It's now Ladoff Lane subdivision. So right behind the farm stand, back there was right next to it. So this is all houses now. This is pre the houses. This is all houses. It's a 13-unit subdivision. And that's Tara's Lane right there. Next slide. Not a great shot. And this is being filmed, and the slides are going to be posted for anyone that actually wants to take a closer look, since some of these are tough to see in the light. But that's all pure native grassland, and there's a lot of beautiful pitch pines that they took by themselves. So it's a regeneration. We're looking at close to 20 years now of regeneration on its own with some assistance. We actually went out there and bought bags from Pennsylvania of native grassland seeds, 50-pound bag, and spread them out. We had people spread them out by hand. Next slide. One of our projects was a bird box project. Got a small grant from someone, I think it was from the Toad Hall bookstore. Sorry to say goodbye to Toad Hall, but they were really great for projects like this. I think they gave us $200 to have the scouts build bird boxes and install them. And then 2 days later, vandals went out there and busted all the bird boxes. And I made sure the press got a hold of that. I made sure there was a front page. We got them all rebuilt. Within 1 week, all those bird boxes were still back up. And we did see bluebirds down there. We got, and some of those box posts are still there. Those posts are made of locust. They'll probably last 50 years. Native locust, not treated, will last a long time. So there's probably an empty box down there if anyone wants to install a bird box. But trying to get people's involvement at every age group, getting the scouts involved, getting adults. Nick Barletta came down here one day, spent the day scraping with me. It was great. Next slide, please. And this was a different part of that project. We got, I can't remember where we got the money for. I think it was just part of it. We said, let's try it. We bought 2 American chestnuts that were semi-disease resistant and 2 American elms. And we planted them at 4 different locations. And the 2 chestnuts didn't make it. The disease resistance of chestnuts is still just not there. One of the elms made it 2 years and it died. That American elm is down there right now, and it's almost 30 feet high. I mean, it was really nice to see an American. It took off. We'll see if it makes it. I mean, it's made it that far, and it's looking really good. Next slide. Okay, I'm moving on to the next project. Again, I'm trying to give you a smattering of all these years in chronology of looking at the different parameters within Millbrook. And this approach can be applied anywhere, to any watershed, to any size watershed, and anyone can pick up the ball and run with it. What this was a grant that the DPW and my wife Julie led this one up, working with the DPW, and I was the gopher. I don't take credit for the project, I didn't write it, but I was kind of the gopher guy. Go take the pictures, crawl in the river, go, how many of you know the culvert at the front beach that connects Millbrook Meadow? How many of you have crawled all the way through it? All the way, all the way. I've been through it many times now. And one time, this is no joke, it has nothing to do with this project. In the middle of the road, under Beach Street, it was clogged, and I went under to unclog it. You and me away from a beaver, popped his head up, and I'm like this, with the water up to here. I almost had a heart attack. It was scary. I'll be perfectly honest with you, and I moved out of there as fast as I could. So that was part of my job, was to go around and go to those places and take pictures to see what's going on under there. And what this was a grant to look for sources of pollution in Lower Millbrook. Same principles would apply to Upper Millbrook, higher up, but we were looking at the Lower Millbrook. There's the train station right there, there's Pools Lane, and there's where Millbrook crosses Pools Lane. We scoured the whole stream from here all the way down to the beach. And lo and behold, I think we found 34 culverts discharging into Millbrook. Do we even know what some of them are today? No. Some were just storm drains, some squirted at us when we went by, literally, like all of a sudden, psh. And we found a couple of those. A lot of these things aren't supposed to be there, or it's not good to have them there, let's put it that way. So this was a plan that was put together, working with the DPW to make them aware of some of these from our permitting for stormwater, but also we put together a plan for the DPW to work on storm drain cleaning. So getting this grant helped educate the town the importance of cleaning out storm drains, because when a storm drain fills up with junk, it might still work from a moving the water perspective, but it's not collecting the junk anymore if you don't clean it once in a while. And then that's the stuff that goes out and discharges out some of these pipes, and then where does it end up? Mill Pond. And if you ever wonder why we just spent close to $1 million dredging Mill Pond, it's because we don't clean out storm drains and take care of things, and they all end up behind a dam. So they're all interrelated. The junk may go away, not be in the storm system anymore, but it ends up somewhere else. Or overflows Mill Pond, and then it's down at the beach. And then you wonder why the beach closes sometimes, because we're not taking care of things quite good enough upstream. So anyway, about 34 discharges we found. A number of them have been addressed by the DPW, private citizens, and even through the Millbrook project. So a number of these have been addressed. I'm not going to say all of them have been. I'll say probably more should be. But just to kind of give you an idea of what we found. 34 discharges. Okay, next slide. We also did dye testing. George Robertson took the lead on this. Bags of green dye. Because we don't even the DPW doesn't know where all the pipes go. We actually went out into the middle of Evans Field and dumped a gallon of green dye in the drain in the middle of the field. Where does it come out? No one even knew. Not until you see the green bubbling out somewhere in Millbrook. And sometimes we poured the water in and it never came out anywhere. And we had to do this in big rain events. So this was storm sampling only. You don't go out on a sunny day and do this. You need a heavy rain event. That was an entrance to the L.E. Smith's. We poured the water in there, it just didn't even go in the drain. It went nowhere. So it ends up that drain was all clogged up. It doesn't exist anymore. They end up paving it over. So that got rid of that problem. Make the storm drain go away. And that's a railroad ave in front of the old Dunkin' Donuts. You can't see it well, but that's some of our green dye popping up. But just the ways we look for where these problems are, where they're going. Because it tells you, maybe, if these kind of things, maybe that's why. Okay, it's coming from this location when you know something bad's going. And you try to correlate, maybe that's why we're finding this problem downstream half a mile away. But really hard to find these things. Next slide. Is just a couple of the pictures. This was my gopher work, walk up and down the stream and look for pipes. And you can see how much of a mystery some of them are. That's a little discharge, really snuck in there, just sticking out of the ground about an inch in heavy vegetation. That's a fall picture. In the summer you'd never see it. Unless you're standing there, like a lot of the people in Millbrook Meadow would also, what's that noise? Whoosh, squirting right out in Millbrook Meadow from a private property, from their cellar. Sump pump. No easement, no permit to be on town property, and especially not discharging junk like that. And the restoration of Millbrook cooperatively worked with that owner and came up with a wet well system to allow it to percolate into the ground without it just discharging into the brook and then being at the beach maybe within 8 or 9 seconds. Who knows what's in that cellar? So this was one that got resolved, but you got to find the problems before you can solve them. And then, a couple more here. One was pretty blatant, a 4-inch pipe, and then another one of these hidden ones. This is not unique to Rockport. This is everywhere down. But you got to look to find them and then address them. Next slide. You might recognize the background there, some of you. But this was kind of one of the nastier ones. That's Millbrook Park. And I don't know if anything's ever done with that or what's going on, but it's probably just iron, but it certainly doesn't look good. I mean, this brown stuff oozing out, spreading all out. It's probably a mixture of algae, iron. I'm not saying it's anything bad, but you still don't like seeing something like that pouring into Millbrook that you know is going downstream to the beach, the places where kids play and everything. But we found lots of them. Next slide, please. Next project we worked on. And I say we, because many people worked on these. I'm just the noisy one. Wellfield Protection Plan. We got another grant from the state to actually put together a protection plan. We didn't actually have a plan. There were no documents anywhere that said this is how to protect your wellfield. Which is you'd think you'd have that. We had no plan, there was no emergency response, there was nothing. And we got a grant to help do public education. This is actually one of the brochures that was sent out, I believe, to every resident in the watershed, well, the whole town. I can't remember all the water bills. We actually had a brochure made out. Because, actually, how many people in this room, before even I was talking, know where Millbrook Wellfield is? Raise your hand. Now look at that. See, a lot of us don't even know where this wellfield is. That's why we actually came up with the brochure. It's literally located about 500 feet upstream of the train station. There's a wellfield here for municipal drinking water. And we found over and over again, no one knows it's there. out of sight, out of mind. But, you know, so it's good that that's why we did this. That's why I'm doing this again tonight, too. So at least some of you are going to know where that well field is. Basically, there's a red line there showing the area of contribution. At the top of that map is the train station, Blue Pond, the restoration area is right there, and then that's Briar Swamp in the middle of Dogtown. Basically, any drop of rain that drops within that concentric circle makes it into Millbrook, down to Front Beach, unless it gets extracted out the wells, and then it ends up off Bearskin after going through our sewage treatment plant and bypasses the beach. Goes into our drinking water. Next slide, please. The Mill Pond Dam failure. Obviously, I look up and down. When you deal with watersheds, you just continuously look downstream, you look upstream. You're looking for issues, you learn what's going on. And that was the picture, I believe, the morning of, or the day before the dam failed. I was down there taking pictures. And I do have an email, I'll be honest about it. I have an email somewhere that something's got to be done here, this dam's going to fail. I saved it, I have it somewhere. It failed. And it went. These invasive birds loved it because they got a bigger pond, the swans. This is what was going on before the dam failed because there wasn't enough capacity for the water to get through the culvert underneath the dam. You couldn't get underneath the dam because people had put sandbags in front of the culvert because people like to see the pond level higher. You know, everyone likes more water, just walk up the culvert. And there was not enough capacity for the water to get out. So you have a 12-inch rain event on the Mother's Day storm, not even close, couldn't keep up. So flooded the whole thing. The wall of the dam prevented the water, and it all went down the meadow and made a new stream there. And it shredded the meadow, as many of you know, shredded, destroyed the meadow. Next slide. And there's Mill Pond Dam. It probably 80% failed. It didn't 100% fail. And what I mean by that is the back wall didn't completely go, and all the material that was in the pond didn't go downstream, which was very lucky, because it ends up was all contaminated. All of sediments in Mill Pond was contaminated. Every bit of it had to go to a lined landfill. It had an exorbitant cost to the taxpayer, us. But luckily it didn't fail, though the dam failed and the water discharged down there and made a big mess of things. My work is dam removal, as many of you know. I advocated to remove the dam. I lost that battle. And this is, in many cases, this is a legitimate one to lose that battle on. There are eels that go upstream, as many of you know. There aren't anadromous fish that need to get upstream. It's worked out well. We've found excellent opportunities to still capitalize on the situation. Next slide. This was the rebuilding of the dam. I stayed part of that from soup to nuts, following it, looking at the permits, assisting, because this is the kind of work I do in my day job, so they got me for free in Rockport to help out, just kind of sticking my nose into it. Sometimes people prefer I didn't, but I did. And the project proceeded. And had time of year restrictions. You couldn't do it certain times of the year to protect the fish, certain times of the year to protect the frogs, and in particular the eels. And about this time, we started monitoring American eels in Millbrook, and we started catching some. I think the first year we caught 5 on this track, this Irish track that just didn't work. But we knew there were eels in here. We also caught baby, I actually found them, rainbow smelt. How many of you have eaten rainbow smelt before fried? Come on, gotta be more than that. Oh boy, they spawn in Millbrook. I found eggs down by Front Beach. Rainbow smelt spawn in that brook. So we have diagonus, a fish that needs to go to fresh water to lay its eggs in Millbrook, and American eels that need to get upstream as part of their life cycle. So there are a lot of protection measures that I kind of followed on this project. Next slide. There's the lovely pond with just a little bit of water left in it. If I recall, that was probably less water than they were supposed to keep in there. They were supposed to keep enough to keep the fish alive, so I was going down there continuously looking for stranded turtles, stranded animals, everything. But during the rebuilding of the dam, we moved some of the fish, but water was maintained in there. A lot of fish died, but a very high percentage of them lived. The turtles could hunker down in the mud, and then they rebuilt it and the water went back up. So rebuilt the dam first, got it back up and running, but part of the piece of the dam that as you may know, is an eel ladder on it now. The old dam did not have an eel ladder. And that, I believe, is the first dam rebuilt by the Federal Emergency Management Agency that they had to pay for an eel ladder. You're going to rebuild the dam? Where's your fish passage? That message got across to them somehow or another. And they actually included the funding to put an eel ladder on it. We got it peer reviewed by a number of fish passage engineers. And we have that eel ladder on there that has actually worked really well. I'll touch on that in a moment. But next slide, please. Rebuilding of the dam. I was down there every day, checking it out. Really fun to watch these things. Half the time I'm watching the rebuild, and then half the time I'm upstream looking at the junk in the mud. And some of those bottles over there on that table actually might be from Rockport. I should sort them better by place. They've lost a lot of their historical perspective. They're just garbage at this point in the pond. They're not part of a site. But some of them over there could be from Rockport. Next slide. Oh, by the way, just wait, back up one. Just so you know, this is a coffer dam. That's I'll call a porta dam. They're holding back the water with that, is what they're doing while they build the dam. And they're pumping the stream. As the stream keeps running, you couldn't tell the stream to stop running, so you have to bypass all the water around your construction site. So they're holding it back with an artificial dam while they rebuild the dam. This is probably one of the best built dams in Massachusetts, and I don't say that jokingly. It will be here 300 years, 300 feet of sea level rise. It will be there underwater. It's built that good. You may look at it, it looks like an old dam. It has an absolutely super strong, engineered, solid concrete core. Everything you see is just a facade to hold some of the historical provenance of it. That can fall apart. That concrete will stay. Next slide. Dedication event for the new dam. And there's the new eel ladder, you can see. Part of the reason for the new eel ladder is old dams, and that was an old dam, parts of that went back to the 1700s. It was dry laid stone with a little bit of mortar. Eels that would have still actually made it over it, because the eels have the ability to make it over wet surfaces and through interstitial spaces between rocks and cobble and sticks. And that dam was so in such lousy shape, eels could make it over it. That was part of the reason we said you have to put an eel ladder on it, because this is a brand new dam. They're not going through solid concrete. There's no way they're going through or up and over that dam. Some might make it over. So that's the new eel ladder, and that was the day it was dedicated. And of course, I made it a point of having Senator Bruce Tarr do the inaugural transfer of eels that we caught downstream to transfer them upstream to the new refilled mill pond. And some of those eels will live in Mill Pond for 10 to 30 years, or go further upstream to Loop Pond. So we let some go. Next slide. And then a couple years later, as you know, it took more than a couple, how to restore the meadow. So this is not the way you really want to do a project. I advocated strongly that we should come up with a master plan of the meadow before we rebuild the dam. And sometimes you got to follow the money. The money was available to rebuild the dam, and no one wanted to wait. But we still had to deal with all the dredging, because the pond was filled almost entirely to capacity, and everybody wanted a pond. So the perfect time would have been when they dewatered it 5 years earlier. It just didn't work out that way. So permits, design, lots of outreach meetings, designs, and a lot of public input is what was needed. And it came up with a plan that most everybody was very comfortable with. And this is now the dredging of Mill Pond. And in this project, they did completely dewater it, and I rounded up as many volunteers from the Cape Air Environmental Pond team and local people, and we scoured this and grabbed every eel we could find. We got over 50 turtles, we marked them, we took thousands of fish up the Loop Pond in the back of my truck, we loaded them into buckets and released them upstream. So they stayed within the watershed, and most of them have returned. Either the babies made it downstream since then. No one's stocked Mill Pond. It's filled with right now with bass and pickerel. They just made it back downstream on their own to a restored habitat. They now actually have their pond back. No one that I know of, I've not heard anyone that said they put a turtle down there. The turtles are all back. They just made it down from Loop Pond. Turtles are like rats. I mean, if you catch a rat or a raccoon and drag it a half mile, they'll be back 2 days later. Turtles are the same thing. So they're all back there. The picture of this one is actually the very last turtle I found in Mill Pond. I believe it was in early December. And I felt it was a tiny little turtle that year hatched, and it was too late to release it. It was too cold. So I talked to some friends and got basically the advice on how to keep it going over the wintertime. And that thing fattened up. It tripled in size over the wintertime, and it's a head start program. It wouldn't have grown at all in the wintertime. They wouldn't have. They hibernate in the winter and they actually lose weight. But instead, we fed it all winter long, and it just, look, it's round. It's not even fat like a turtle. I mean, flat. And we did a release of him the next springtime. So he lived in our house all winter long. So he's in it, he or she's in Mill Pond somewhere, and there's still lots of snappers. But anyway, all the sediments in Mill Pond are contaminated. All had to be dredged and disposed. And that's something you got to think about. Why is it contaminated? Where did it come from? Storm drains, railroad station, cars, septic systems, me, you. I mean, all of us contributed in some way or the other. That material goes downstream, connects to sediments. A river that didn't have a dam, those sediments would have gone out to sea and probably just pollution's dilution, it probably just would have never been seen. It would have been long, but we accumulated it for 100 years behind this dam, maybe 200. When we removed the dam, I found, all kinds of junk in here from easily 100 years ago. So it was an accumulation. But that's what costs a lot. And that's something we're also trying to prevent. When we're all gone and someone decides they need to dredge the pond again, it'd be nice to let them have a pond that needs to be dredged with clean sediments, not polluted ones. So that's where upping the ante now with everybody to try to do better protection of Millbrook will leave the next generation with maybe not the mess that we had to restore Millbrook and the Mill Pond. Next slide. The lower Millbrook, and this is Laura's story, but I had to put this in here for certain. For those who, that used to be the straight walled lower Millbrook, which is now an extremely successful and super highlighted habitat restoration project for a stream. I highlight this to people all throughout New England, the job down here. I brought a number of out-of-town people that do this work to see what was done in Millbrook. It's done that well. Next slide. Mill Pond. How many of you know about the eels? You know about them from me telling tonight. Anyone here have eel tickets? Any hands? Oh, we got about 10. We do a raffle now of how many eels we catch every year. And I looked at, I see the count, July 5th. We had 1,042. We have 6 to 10 volunteers that help me every year. One person counts the eels every day, different day of the week, from April 1 to Columbus Day. That's the migration season. They come up as early as April, and they'll come as late as early October. And one year we only got 5, another year we got 200. Last year we got 1,794. So it's a fun little raffle. It's not my raffle. I just kind of count the fish. Someone else runs the raffle. It's a 50-50, and the 50% that's collected that stays with restoration of Millbrook. So the money that they keep is actually just to do more of the good work. But we're up to 1,176 since July 5th. I got a big day on Saturday. I got 30. But just to show you, people always ask how big do they get. At least one of you know, we do get big ones. That's a Millbrook eel right there on one of the student days that I was down here teaching the 5th graders. And that's a bucket of about 500 that was one day's catch 4 years ago. One day. One day we caught more than we sometimes catch in a whole year. Don't ask me why. Mystery of eels. Next slide. Okay, the mystery bottles. No one had heard of this. Well, I know one person in the room that's heard of this. So anyway, a couple of times we did birthday cleanups near the railroad track. Actually, I've done the dump before. I led a birthday cleanup around the dump. That was the worst ever. The new transfer station, going in the woods around it, all the bags and garbage, but that was the worst. But doing near the railroad line is not too fun either. All the things get thrown and it's not a safe place, so you kind of need to not go right on it, that type of thing. And we live near there, we do a lot of dog walks. And we started seeing more plastic bottles, and it was just kind of like the big tanker truck that I thought, what's going on here? I have to ask that question. Question authority, what is going on here? And then I take some, and I cleaned out an area, and then more appeared. This is over weeks and months, and I was asking everyone, trying to figure out what's going on. I went to the police station, trying to find out, what is this? Dasani bottles. And, this is what we find. Bottles. And they're the same brand, 2 or 3 brands, tossed all at the same location in your well field. This wasn't up and down the tracks, this was in your well field on town property. Next slide. That's the town's well field right there. There's the newspaper. I did that to show the date because I was starting to monitor it to show they showed up. I had a picture from the day before. I'm like, look, a new bottle showed up. Something's going on here. And it had something to do with the train. And a policeman actually said, you know what I think they are? Spittoon bottles. Conductors spitting in bottles, and then when they're done, chucking them into the town's well field. Hundreds of them. And we slowly figured this out. And then I started like, how do we find out who this is? And of course, no, everyone's mom. And you know someone knows if someone's chewing tobacco that much that someone else knows. Anyway, next slide. There's the well field, just I want you to know that, and that's, those bottles were all found within maybe 100 feet of those. 3 8-inch gravel-packed wells that only withdraw water from about 25 to 40 feet. These are shallow wells, real shallow. These aren't 500 feet down into bedrock like some of you might have. This is gravel-packed, 25 to 40 feet down. Garbage can get there pretty quick if they're running those. So those bottles were all up and down the railroad tracks. And you see the cables in the upper left corner? That's the railroad tracks. Just below that. So there's the railroad tracks. There's the 3 wells. They're parallel. This is not a good situation for railroad or drinking water, but it is what it is. Next slide. You know, I can fill bags of them. Those are all these Dasani bottles filled with brown, gross liquid. This is at the time the MBTA was talking about a hush hut and trying to redo the train station. And there were a couple of high-level meetings that took place at the new place station. And I showed up at one of them, and Ann Margaret Ferranti was there, and Senator Tar, and at least 6, maybe 7 people from MBTA, and maybe another 8 or 9 of their consultants. Probably wasn't that many. And I brought a few bottles with me. And at that time, I figured the caper out, and I didn't hesitate to bring it up at that meeting, and made some people really embarrassed, and put an end to it on the spot. But it was like, but it took that kind of effort. You know, the head of MBTA was there, and I gave him the history. This was over a year of tracking this down. You know, I get better things. I'd rather be fishing. I'd rather be out canoeing and paddling. Yes.
Which to me begs the question, why were you, isn't this something that's DPW should have been on?
Yes. Everybody, well, yes. And they were. They weren't not helping, but they weren't tracking it down. I was. And at this time, I can't remember if we had the Watershed Protection Committee then or not. In some ways, this is where I say volunteers come in a town like Rockport. Often, protection of our resources in making things happen often actually is us. It's the volunteer work in small towns like this. But you're absolutely right. It's both. It needs both. So I'm not going to point the finger and say, but I'm also making you aware that and I work for the government. Government doesn't just fix everything and make everything right, local, state, or federal. Because me just stomping around finding these problems. This is just opening my eyes, turning my brain on. Dumping lead near well fields, not a good idea. Throwing garbage in well field, not a good idea. So at least I'm hopefully stopping a few. Next slide. Oh, lovely. So now I'm going to touch on some railroad issues in this pile. And I've left out many. I'm just hitting the smattering. As you can see, I'm going through time. So this is 2015. Up to this point, we've been making a lot of noise with the railroad on other issues, with their activities with herbicides and pesticides, spraying the tracks. Please don't do it here. No. And you have to remind them. And then, I think this is 2015, you could smell this a half mile away if you opened your nose. They're doing track work somewhere between here and Boston, and they decided to store hundreds of freshly dipped creosote ties right next to the well field. They're dripping. You could smell them literally a half mile away. And they're dripping creosote, proven carcinogen. Stored. That's just, oh, this is our area to do this. And we're like, this is the zone 1 of the well field, within 250 feet of the actual wellheads. And I flagged them on that. Like, what is going on here? And then they moved them. But it shouldn't take that. They shouldn't have been there in the first place. The MBTA should know that. They should be looking at the resource maps to say, town of Rockport's well field. You don't do these activities next to it. You don't store stuff next to a well field. It's on maps. I showed you the maps earlier. Those are state maps and local maps. Their exemptions are part of the problem, which I'm going to get to. Anyway, while this was going on, another of the reasons I went to a lot of the MBTA meetings and others, we were pushing, at the very least, if they rebuild the station, to remove all creosote railroad ties and replace them with either concrete or some other material that is used in other places in this country. They said, no, no, no. I mean, trying to fight, as you know, it's not a joke. Fighting railroads is about as hard as it gets. I've done it on a number of cases in the Northeast. It's very difficult. Their exemptions go back before there was any laws. They wrote the exemptions before there were laws. And they said a couple times, maybe, and then you'd never see them another year. Maybe, then a plan set would come out and said, yes. Then it went away. Oh, we didn't get the funding for it. And then it used to be the MBCR, then Keolis got the contract. Totally new company, French company comes in and runs the railroads now. They don't have any of this history. New elected officials, new DPW workers. This is where continuity comes in, saving these records. And we pushed and pushed and pushed. So, next slide, please. And this is just 2 years ago. I'm getting up to the present. These here are recycled plastic, non-leaching railroad ties. When they redid the railroad line from Rockport to Gloucester with the train bridge down, I think it was like 10,000 new railroad ties, non-leaching. And I'm quite sure, I didn't get a quote from him, that Senator Tarr heard enough from us and told them, please do this. And they did. All the railroad ties in Rockport and Gloucester are non-leaching, recycled plastic. It's like, 15 years and they didn't want to do it. Yeah, it probably costs more and they don't know the technology. But that was the good side. And this is what was going on when COVID was. Remember how many of you drove between Rockport and Gloucester and saw activity going on? There were no permits because they're exempt. Everyone was hiding in COVID. But I'm like, what's going on? Even I wasn't running down here too much. And I started going, what are they doing? And they were replacing culverts up and down the railroad line between Rockport and Gloucester. And I'm looking at them going, do these require a permit? I do federal permitting too. These require some other permits. They didn't get their 401 quality permit from the state. They did an Army Corps of Engineers permit, and I turned it in. And then, of course, they just scramble on it and fire something in real quick. Half these permits were being done illegally in the Gloucester's watershed and in the Rockport's watershed. And they're exempt from local jurisdiction. But they didn't even have the other permits. At this site, which I'm not on there right away, they built a cofferdam here, they blocked the stream, they flooded 3 to 4 acres of wetland upstream. Their permit that they even submitted said we're going to only impact a couple hundred square feet. I documented acres. That's even with their permit that they got after the fact. It's just paperwork sometimes going through the process. So anyway, next slide. This is right next to the well field. So there's those telephone poles again. That truck is located within 80 feet of an actual one of those wellheads I showed you. And what they're doing here is it's basically a caravan to do railroad tracks. One of them lifts up the track, one of them does this, one does that. And what they were doing is taking all the creosote railroad ties and side casting them. They're chucking them off to the side, and all piles of those. And for full disclosure, I'm an abutter. So I should have said that earlier. Many of you know that. But this is one of the things you get when you get in a butter like me. They dumped it on my property. And they dumped it on the town's well field. Creosote railroad ties, because they didn't think about the resources. They're just pulling them out as fast as they can and chucking them off to the side to put the new good creosote ones in. So it's really a tough situation. The plan on paper is this really good thing. We follow all rules, regulations, and do things really good, and we're going to do it with new good means and methods. But then you actually go look, and it's often the case. There's things going on that aren't good. There's no way those should have been dumped next to the town's well field. They should have been picked up, put in a truck right away, so that when the rain doesn't hit them, just dropping them makes them fall apart. They're 80, 50-year-old creosote railroad ties. They fall apart. Next slide. And you see the date, that's April 2020. That is the town's well field right there. You're looking at town property. Town of Rockport owns that. And it was Joe Parisi, his GIS manager, and myself that actually discovered that they didn't even know their own property lines. They thought at first they owned the property. It was the town of Rockport and private citizens on both sides. But they still made a mess of it, and things fell onto the town's well field. on private property. Those were all the discarded ones. They got them off there pronto once phone calls started going through, but it shouldn't have taken that. It shouldn't have been a temporary storage place. You recognize it was a good thing they were doing. They should have been removed, placed in a truck. It probably would have cost a little bit more, but that's doing it right when you get extra drinking water. Next slide. This is a new station that they built. This didn't need a permit. You know, if any of you built something like that next to the town's well field, do you think you'd get a permit? Right? They don't even have to ask for one. They're exempt to just build whatever they want. The local Board of Health, local Concom, DPW, no local jurisdiction to even protect our drinking water. And it needs to change. That's kind of my punchline at the end here. So that was the station they were building. Town's well field. There's the building they're going to put there. They just went down there, dug this all up, and then dropped it in. You know, I'm not saying the station wasn't needed. Means and methods for protection. Next slide. Municipal efforts to protect the well field. This is modern. 2019, 2022. Rockport Conservation Commission wrote numerous letters, had meetings with the MBTA and their staff, asking for things to be done, such as not storing any of the materials when they do excavation. In particular, they asked that any material that's underneath the railroad bed is taken off-site and replaced with clean fill. They said no, won't do it. We want to use the old fill underneath the railroad line next to your well field. The Rockport Public Works, on record in writing to MBTA, asking them to take these measures. They refused. The Ad hoc Water Committee, I believe, made comments on this as well. The Rockport Board of Health made comments. All of your local boards tried to protect your water supply here. They tried. And the 401 water quality certificate from the state got issued. Rockport Board of Health appealed it. That is very rare for a local municipality to appeal a state permit for something like this. They said, we have to. They tried. And then the state came in and said, you can't appeal this permit. A, you don't have jurisdiction. And it ends up, we don't really have to issue a permit here because the wetland line is 6 inches over. It's not 6 inches this way. There wasn't a permit. All of a sudden, after a permit got applied for, issued, the DEP decided the permit was no longer required. So we couldn't even appeal a permit. There was no permit to appeal. So they got their consensus written recommendations to MBTA and Keolis that all excavated material on the tracks be disposed of off-site and simply replaced with new fill. Think about it. I've seen, many of you probably have too, every train that goes by drips something, just like my car and yours, but it's been consistently dripping at these locations. It's a known site. It's just known. Railroad tracks are typically contaminated, whether it's debris, soap, or drippage from tanks, hydraulic fluid, transmission fluid. They wouldn't do it. We even got quotes that would set a bad precedent for our construction activities. I've heard that by construction managers. So, Board of Health did everything they could. Everybody did everything they could. One of the culverts, the one that was closest to the well field, they did all the culverts but that one, partly because of the landowner issues. The town of Rockport and immediately butter said you can't go on our property. And you don't have an easement or anything. So they just didn't do that one. And they went away for a year and a half. Next slide, please. So the railroad was almost all done. So here's the letter that went out to the town of Rockport, dated May 9th, 2022. How long ago was that? A couple months ago. You can't read this. This is from Keolis. We're informing you, this May 9th, received. We're replacing a culvert on May 10th. Next to your well field. They've known about this and concerns of every board in town and citizens of Rockport. I will contend strongly, this is intentional. We're going to go in there, we're going to do this fast, and we're not going to let anybody do anything about it. May 9th, there's written record, administrative record, in many sources that says that Rockport raised an issue here. And they sent the email at 5 o'clock from Keolis. On Friday. 5 p.m. I happened to get an email on Friday. The letter was received. How many town municipal employees are working at 5 p.m. on a Friday? Not many.
Not here.
How many people are looking at their this kind of stuff on, well, I was. And I called the lady up immediately. She answered the phone. It was a new person running the environmental department. And I asked her, on Saturday, I called her and I said, so did you get an easement to work on my property? Because your plan that I'm looking at shows you're on my property and on the town of Rockport. So did you get an easement from the town of Rockport or me? And she said, well, we found evidence that we have an easement, which I actually believed her because they were pretty good at those things. And I said, I'd like to see it. So it's been a year and a half. They knew we knew this issue. She goes, I have to talk to general counsel before I send it to you. It's obviously public information. Yeah, I received it Saturday afternoon, I believe. Or was it Monday morning? It was Saturday afternoon. It was the wrong easement. It had nothing to do with the property they were talking about. They didn't even have the right easement. It's like, this is just a kangaroo court. And they just screamed this through. They had police down there to make sure that no one disturbed them. I called the police. And they modified the project design and installed it differently so that they did not actually physically touch the town of Rockport property or the abutter's property within inches and just stuffed it in. But here's the record. May 9th, the town of Rockport received this. And this is your government at state level knew about this, that we had concerns. They did it anyway without any coordination or ignored it all. Pretty bad. Next slide. There's the site right there. That's pre-new culvert. Those three wells, one's right here, one's right here, and one's right here. And they're going to blow under that railroad bed and put a 48-inch culvert underneath there. And we weren't against anything, no one, no board, no committee, no individual was against anything that they needed to do. It was means and methods. If you're going to, that's a station area. If you're going to remove that material, 5, 10 cubic yards. What's 5 to 10 cubic yards of gravel cost? A couple $100, right? A couple $100. Just they're removing thousands and thousands of cubic yards of material. Please remove that, backfill it with clean material. No, won't do it. Because why do you think? A precedent, maybe it's contaminated because they have to test it. Because if they had to remove it for that reason, it means they should probably test it. But that all just kind of went away. And they proceeded. Next slide. There they go. That actually is the property line. That's a no trespassing sign, and that's a no trespassing sign that somebody put up. I took the day off from work, so this cost me a day of pay, day of work, and this is where I stood for that day. Okay, next slide. You know, if you look around Rockport, you won't find any soil that color anywhere naturally occurring. See that? That's gravel. That's crud. This is some sort of utility line running through here. This is just stuff right below the tracks. It's clearly got something in it. I don't know what's in it. I'm not going to say it's carcinogenic or whatever it is. But the word is due diligence. Due diligence is, do you think something might be here? I found lots of documents that clearly say you always assume contamination under a railroad track, especially in a railroad station. This is a station. So anyway, that's what we found. One of the other things that came up during the review process early was I asked them what they were going to do about water. I said, you're going to hit groundwater. Oh, we're not going to hit groundwater. I said, what do you mean you're not going to hit groundwater? The town well field's right there, and there's wells to show how deep the water is. They had no plans for contingency when they hit the groundwater table. Of course they did. It wasn't in their plans at all. They didn't even think about it. Next slide. Those are the culverts, just to give you an idea of how big they were. That's right next to Evans Field. Next, then there's the police watching over things, because they called them, and I did as well. Next slide. And look, water. I actually got as good a close-up as anyone would ever get on a construction site. I wore my orange vest and my hard hat, so I was at least safe. And of course, I wanted to go take a close look. And they had their environmental monitor there and some other people. Next slide. You tell me. That's an oil sheen. All across that water. What kind of oil? Don't know. It's some sort of something. And I pointed it out. The environmental monitor never walked over. Wouldn't look at it. Wouldn't look at it. And they quickly proceeded and filled it in. I told DPW, I told the state. You know, it's assumed to be, it's no surprise to me. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone to find something like that under a railroad station. That water level is the same level as the well field 80 feet away. And we know it's there, it's not good, but part of it was you're disturbing it, and you're breaking it up, and you're allowing it to move more. These are the things that we're bringing up. They just backfilled it, they put the culvert in. Next slide. Here it goes, real quick. The person all the way in the back here, there's the environmental monitor. That's as close as she got. And when asked, didn't see anything. That was a quote. Didn't look. I was there the entire time. I will say that. I don't lie. Someone could say otherwise, but I was there all day. Next slide. Summary and conclusions. Sorry for going a little long, but I wanted to give you that history. Threats to water resources is never ending. It must be viewed at the watershed perspective and not just at the faucet. You know? And it's not just at the treatment plant. It's all these little parameters. And especially, you know, we've managed to deal with the big chemicals. It's the real fine ones now that we haven't even studied yet, that obviously we worry about. And I'm going to push this out there to everybody in this room. And the Board of Health, just so you all know, the Board of Health actually had a vote last Thursday to write a letter to Senator Tar and Verga. They haven't drafted it yet, but they had a public meeting, and they had a vote to draft a letter requesting that our state legislature take away the exemption. There is an exemption, and all we ask for, that they ask for, is in the zone 1 of a municipal well field, local jurisdiction needs to be allowed. And this sends that message home, that they're not doing what they're supposed to be to protect our drinking water. That exemption just allows them to go roughshod. And that's exactly what they did, and it was well documented here numerous times. Town of Rockport and any other municipality that has a well field near a railroad line needs the ability to protect our water supply. They tried. I'm not pointing the finger at anyone to say they didn't try. They tried. DPW, Board of Health appealed the state permit. I mean, that's rare. And then everyone at the local level is like, well, town council says we can't do anything about it. Well, this is where a law change comes in. This is something that needs to be changed. So, questions? I'm done. Okay.
I realize the time frame was really short, but would it help if there was able to get people there to protest?
I did. We had a protest.
Oh, and getting involved in the Boston Club, did you invite the Boston Club then?
There was a protest. Actually, we had some of it filmed, and it's actually online. You can actually see some of the materials that came from it. There were some still shots taken. One of the Board of Selectmen actually reached out to a number of newspapers. None of them covered it, which was weird. Don't know why. I'm not necessarily done with this, but none of them covered it. I don't know why. We reached out to the Times and a couple others. And you know, and sometimes it's only so much energy. To be honest with you, that's where individual citizens get beat down when you try to tackle these things. You can only do so much. But this is another opportunity to let people know.
Does our drinking water come from the well fields or from the quarries?
It comes from all of them. Right now, it doesn't come from that well field, but it's fully permitted. They can turn it on tomorrow. We can drink it tomorrow. It's because of the deep rock wells. We actually technically all 5 of those areas, including Rockport Well Field, are part of our water system. Chris Martin can turn on any one of them, and Rockport Well Field is not great water to begin with. It's got a lot of iron and manganese in it, and it's harder to treat. But we drank it for years. So I was drinking it when I moved here for years. They only stopped using it. We've had a lot of rain in the past few years, and the deep rock wells near Cape Pond have offset the need. But who knows what the future brings? One spill that gets, say, something happens at Flatledge or Carlson or Cape Pond, or the building burns down that the deep rock wells are in during a drought, forest fire, all of a sudden you may want those wells. You never give up on a permitted well. If you've got a permitted well system, you'll spend millions to get a new water source in Rockport, if you even get one. Go ahead.
You mentioned that the railroad been there 100 years. Why did the town of Rockport drill those wells?
1930s, because people weren't thinking about those things back then. And this is not a good situation, I'll be the first to say. A well field would never be allowed next to a railroad track now, and a railroad line would never be allowed next to it's a match made in hell, to be honest with you, but it is what it is, and it's not good.
Could you repeat the questions?
I will. Right, yeah, she asked about why did a well field... Okay, yeah, I will. I'll repeat the questions. Go ahead. No, he asked if I've made this presentation. I've made it informally in emails and phone calls to a number of agencies. And, you know, from their seat sometimes it's like, oh, what's the priority? Or what is this? And, you know, is this just someone complaining? But it is due. So his point that he's making is, have I given this presentation to the Department of Public Works? I have informally, I've spoke to many of them, and I've been at a number of their individual meetings, but actually giving this more formally would be a good idea. And maybe I'll talk to Jim Gardner. Probably the last thing he needs is another presentation to him, but I think that's a great idea, and I wouldn't hesitate to do that. Right?
I'm curious, do you drink the water straight from your tap at home?
I have a 582-foot well, but my well is actually near the railroad tracks. So, I don't know, what's better? If it got pumped out and went to the treatment plant and you drink it, or mine, we're all drinking junk somewhere, unfortunately, but yeah. Anything else?
I think you said that there was no plan, no emergency plan for the town.
There is now. We
Okay.
wrote it. The Watershed Protection Committee, working with the Department of Public Works, with one of those grants, we actually have a written emergency plan for the well field. Talks about responses, chain of custody, not chain of custody, phone chain, who calls who. Now the question would be, does anyone even know what that plan is anymore? I haven't been involved with it for 10 years. I'm not saying that against our DPW, it's everywhere. New staff come in and sometimes those things are just in a file somewhere and they need to be reminded.
I just want to thank God that we have Eric and people like him, and thank you, thank you.
Okay, one more. All right, good stuff. All right, well, thank you for everybody coming out. And if, I'll be standing by my bottles over here if anyone wants to look at it. I'm going to go get a glass of wine and put this thing down, and we can all head home. And at least it's got darker for us, so I hope you saw all the slides okay?
Yes.
Good.